Good morning. Sorry, I couldn't join earlier this morning because I was with my students just a few minutes ago. So with my colleague Jérôme Camus, we're going to try to explain the kind of politicization we can find today within youth work in France, and try to have double perspective, one coming from a historical perspective and the other one sociological. First, I will try to share my screen. Is that correct for all? It seems. Well, thanks. So we're try to well, first of all, we have concerning politics within youth work. It's a very strong dilemma that you can find within youth work in France. I'm sure that my students, for example, who are students studying youth work, if I speak with them about politics, they would say first, well, it's very good, but I've got nothing against politics, but, you know, and if you consider the history of youth work, you will find very often this opposition between la politique versus le politique. In French, there's only one word for policy and politics, but with two genders. La politique is something considered as, in the youth work, bad because it means conflicts, it means power, whereas le politique is on the noble side, you know, it's ideas, pure principles, and the civic part of the human being. That's nice. And so youth work, and before it, éducation populaire, stood for le politique. And it's something very deeply rooted in the French society. You could find since the French Revolution. I mean, with there's a famous expression about democracy is demopedia, the idea that education could replace politics, you know, and it's something especially strong within youth work. So we'll try to see what it means today. First, considering how this dimension of the political side of education has been neutralized or externalized within French youth work, and in a second part by Jérôme, under what condition youth work today can contribute to political socialization. So animation, that's more or less the French equivalent for youth work, is heir to a tradition of éducation populaire, which in France, like in many countries, but probably much stronger in our context, in a long rivalry between religious forces, mainly Catholic, and secular republican forces, laïque. This rivalry dating back the revolution in the 19th century. There was also a working class movement, but it didn't play the role it could have had in Britain, for example, or Germany. The main divide is between Catholic and laïc. And this, if you read the history of youth work, popular education, you find that these ideological conflicts have been central in the intention of the leaders. But when you consider the history from from the perspective of the public, of the young people, this dimension may not have been so strong. I mean, with, for example, families going something to knock at the door of the Catholic patronage, and then after to the laic patronage. And so, and when you consider the effective cultural practices, they were very often not so different. After the Second World War, these different forces gain official recognition. It means subsidies. It was something very important in terms of symbolic terms. But in the meantime, this official recognition means a certain fear of neutralization. And the solution found was something called laïcité ouverte, which means an attempt to have both neutralization and a kind of representation of each of the ideological families. And in more concrete terms, I mean, in more specific terms, it means that what was seen as important was what was called educational value of action. I mean, it was a convenient expression, not necessarily very clear, but it acted as a common denominator for public action. And it means that after 1950, there has been a strong distinction between political movement, educational movement, and educational facilities, institution mainly. And it means, roughly speaking, that political movements were put a bit on this. Well, it means surely that it was more difficult for political movement to gain official recognition and subsidies, whereas the educational value of action acted as a sort of a keyword to gain recognition. Like in many other countries, from the 1950s, youth policy, a word that was much used in the 1950s, probably more than in the 1960s. It means youth policy was purely development of educational activities, meaning leisure activities, sport, culture, in what was thought as a democratic perspective, democratic in a sense that for the many, democratic in a sense that it was a way of enhancing critical spirits and civic participation among young generations supposed to be less interested by politics than elders. And also it was democratic in the end, that it was in the sense that it was in the hands of association, of the civil society. It is something that is not always well known, but France has the image of a country where the public service, the state, plays a great role. But concerning youth service, until the last 10 years, the large majority of youth workers, for example, were youth workers working for association, not for the civil service. That's something very new, unlike what happened in Britain, where you have or used to have a large number of local authorities employing youth workers. This led to the 1960s, very often today seen as the golden age of the youth service. Well, and there are some factors accounting for this idea of a golden age. First, the expansion of facilities, the budgets, the professionalization with training, with diplomas, with position created, and also the devaluation of volunteering, seen as out of date by the 1960s. It changes rapidly in the next decade. But this idea of, super decade of the 60s hide, I think, some blind spot. First thing, the fact that youth movement in France have never been mass movement, and youth work facilities never attracted the crowd as well. Unlike in some other countries, youth work and facilities were, and probably are still today, socially selective. The first works of the sociologists of culture in France in the 1960s. They showed as early as 1965 that youth centers were mostly attended by students, by young people belonging to the middle classes and so on. And last point, politicization was much thought in terms of male-oriented conception. I was very surprised yesterday that the gender issue was not mentioned among our talks. But it was also the case in the 1960s. The kind of participation that was prevailing in the youth clubs, for example, was for the young boys, and wasn't put into question. Very often the effective politicization did not come from what was designed to enhance political or civic sense. For example, what was probably what has probably the more importance in enhancing political debate among young people in the 1960s was what was called in French ciné club, film clubs, which was something very important in the 1960s. They were great places for politicization, for debate, for exchanging among young people. But they were, when you think of political education in the youth work in France, you don't first think of them, or I'm pretty sure it is these film club which played the most important role. The same thing could be said of the participation of young people to the administrations of youth club. It was something seen as central. Many people spend years thinking to the best way of electing representative and so on. But it proved to be really effective in politicization. In terms of crisis, when in time of crisis, when there was a move to push out from the board old reactionary old men and to be replaced by young representative. But all the nice structure established by the thinkers of youth work not only work in the same way. If we go to the if we cross through the decade, what is the situation since the 1980s? We have something that I think could be found in any country, a sort of dualization of youth policies with, participatory scheme for the young people doing well in line with employability. Schemes that prove to be socially selective, favoring students and rather also people from the upper class, or at least middle class. And the second orientation, more social, for marginal urban people, namely boys, and the trend towards de-radicalization will probably enhance this social orientation. But dualization should not lead us to ignore that probably, if not a majority, but a large minority is forgotten. I mean, girls, I mean, people from the rural areas, also people from who are not especially doing well at school, but not doing too bad. I mean, what kind of youth policy addresses these young people? The question is to answer, I think. Also, just another point I want to point, because before Jérôme speaks, yesterday Howard Williamson said, more or less, it was probably a bit of a provocation, money is not always the problem, and it certainly is. But I would try to mention the effects of the funding conditions on the matter of politicization. It might seem a far removed notion compared to what we're speaking today, but the end of operating grants and the generalization of the model of project-based funding means that a lot of energy is devoted to immediate management to the expense of the long run. And there are two side effects I would mention, because I think they are very important concerning what we're the question of politicization. It is first the impoverishment of youth work reflection. For example, the end of what I don't know the exact word, but I will call them associative intellectual, organic intellectuals. I mean, people from the inside, not experts from the National Agency of Youth, not academic, but people with a youth work background, but who have time devoted to think, to write, to read, and who are seen by their fellow colleagues, by their fellow youth workers as insiders. And I think that they played a very important role in the 1960s. Today, they have virtually disappeared in French association. The same could be said of review. I mean, for my history work, I read a lot of old reviews, journals of youth work of the 1950s, 1960s, and I think, wow, that's very good compared to, unfortunately, what I can read today and on paper on the web. The second dimension that has been damaged by the transformation of the funding model is the decline of training. I mean, when you don't have enough money, you give the priority to what can bring you back money. And so it means that, well, first you sacrifice the long term. It means intellectual thinking. Then after training, and well, you have to give priority to managers. And youth work associations have a long tradition of promoting their staff. But what is striking since the last 20 or 30 years in France, at least, is the promotion of managers, because they're useful, they are probably very good. And I'm not saying that we don't need managers, but we need managers, we need also trainers, and we need also intellectual. And Jérôme will explain us how today, with his insight of sociologist, he thinks this importance of training and reflection. So, Jérôme, c'est à toi.
Thank you, Darko, for the extra time. Many research papers in political science or sociology demonstrate that the technical abilities, the inclination to have a view, to have interest in politics, to detect differences within the political field, but also the proportion to vote, to sign a petition, or to take part in a social movement is strongly linked with a social competence, with resources, especially in cultural capital, and correlated to social position and gender. We will examine the condition and the situations where youth work may contribute to the transmission of this interest in politics. From this point of view, the importance youth institutions attach to political issues is decisive. This dimension has been strengthening over the last 15 years. Indeed, also youth work organizations and professionals remain, to say the least, cautious in expressing explicitly political position, including when formulating the aims of their actions. Some of them still claim critical or even political content. This was the case from the end of the 2000s, with the emergence of the scope of popular education, new cooperatives created by activists. Bringing together a handful of social workers, youth workers, and activists, this small structure developed a critical analysis of liberalism and the conditions of exercise of the animation profession, which punch the precariousness of working conditions, the enslavement through the inculcation of dedications and vocations, or the liberal dimension of cultural or participation policies. Grouping a small number of activist scopes nevertheless constitute a symbolic point of reference for institutions and professionals. By disseminating their ideas through comedy shows, but also through workshops and books, they have managed to reintroduce into youth work a critical discourse that is fundamentally political in content and compatible with the ordinary working habits of professionals, where is usually found a relative distancing of references to the political or militant field, work on experience, spontaneism, and a second degree in the ways of participation. Without being able to say whether it concerns an ever-increasing number of individuals and organizations, it seems clear that this critical pole exerts a significant influence on youth work. If this tendency toward repoliticization remains limited, the fact is that it tends to reinforce the possibility of a transmission of political content in a certain fraction of youth work, in certain institutions, or through certain professionals. It is the opportunity for political socialization that are reinforced as one gets closer to the critical pole. However, the transmission of political contents that constitute a technical competence that does not only depend on the offer, but also on the disposition already present in the individuals. We would therefore like to be able to examine, finally, how certain institutions of youth work can contribute to the political socialization of young people. If there is an age effect, it has less to do with political orientation than with the modality of participation, youth being a period of discovering opinion and experiencing new practices. The work of Bernard Roudet and Olivier Galland or that of Anne Muxel shows that if young people vote less than their elders, they favor other, less institutional modes of participation, such as signing petitions or participating in social movements. We could thus speak of a youth moratorium. These very classical results of the political sociology of youth do not go without raising questions as to the possible effectiveness of youth work. The weight of the social background of origin, and more particularly of the family, may appear to be so decisive that it would thwart any attempt to arouse interest in politics. But it's worth forgetting that the socialization process is not homogeneous, that different bodies, such as school, peer groups, and of course, youth organization, contribute to the internalization of critical knowledge and practices that do not take place in the family setting. And although survey and the effect of attending youth work institutions on social trajectory or political competence are very few in number, several examples can be drawn on here to suggest their contribution. First of all, it should be noted that the effectiveness of youth works organization methods in transmitting practices and knowledge is well established and is still used by political groups to train their activists. This is, for example, the case studied by Samuel Bouron of Identitaire Summer Camp, which would look very familiar to any youth worker, even if it is an extreme right-wing movement. Coming back to the youth worker, it can be noted that sensitivity to the political dimension of the action is far from being a condition for entering the profession. Among volunteer youth workers, the question of the meaning of the action only becomes apparent very gradually over the course of their career and is first discussed in terms of educative process. The political dimensions only comes into play later still, as may be the case with the trainer who only pay attention to the value of the movement after having invested themselves in it. Indeed, all the adjustment work is needed, which, as experience goes on, will create the feeling that one is in one's place and adherence to ways of doing and thinking, recognition by peer, appropriation of the criteria for judging legitimate practices, way of saying one's vocation, and more broadly, the system of symbolic references that make up the professional culture. Far from the dominant cultivated vision of an explicit learning of political culture, the reasoned elaboration of opinion and the scope of the issue at stake, it seems that the contribution to political socialization that youth work bodies can make is made in a hidden way, under the cover of leisure and almost without noticing it. And it is undoubtedly through regular attendance that gradually builds familiarity that youth work can transmit both the knowledge that enable ordinary experience to be linked to the general mechanism, and above all, the legitimacy to produce and express these links. This is what Stéphane Beau shows about Laila, the second daughter of the family Belloumi, whose parents are Algerian and have immigrated to France. Like all the girls in the family of 8 children, she has an upward social trajectory. But unlike her brothers and sisters, and in particular her elder sister, who owes access to her social and professional position to her exceptional academic success, Leila is less successful. On the other hand, she is developing a much stronger political awareness. Unlike her sister, she has attended leisure facilities from childhood, stressing that they are organized by the municipality, which is strongly left-wing. She identifies in her career path the role of these institutions which enable her to leave the domestic sphere and build a political conscience. Without being militant, she openly supports the left-wing parties, including in the associative commitment she has maintained. This regular and lasting attendance also contributes to opening up professional prospects for her. After a baccalaureate, she studied to become a youth worker and then obtained a university diploma in training. She is now a social worker specializing in youth unemployment. A few words for conclusion. All these examples tend to show that youth work can transmit critical and political knowledge and way to take part in politics or civic affairs, but only if we consider that these transmissions make sense in the wider socialization process in which family and school stay the main bodies. More than a matter of the method used, it is in one hand the duration of attendance and in another hand the importance of political aspects for the institution and their professionals that seem to be efficient in the process. But in the long durations, links with the political field and youth work have been gradually broken. Policy keep an ambiguous position in youth work in France, And even more if you consider that, far from shrinking, the supervision of the French youth take the form of wide scheme actions like the civic service of the blurry project of compulsory universal national service. Without even discussing the relevance of these guidelines in political education perspective, we could stress that it is the French government still which keeps the monopoly of youth political action definitions and to a much lesser extent local authorities. Thank you.